Today we're going back to 1869 to the story of Jabari, a giant African hunter boy whose presence and skills shocked the U.S. South and sparked fear, rumors, and an impossible mystery no one could explain. This is a difficult and intense story, so take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your support helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. In the summer of 1869, on a cotton plantation 40 miles west of New Orleans, a group of wealthy white men gathered for what they called a sporting event. They brought rifles and whiskey and dogs, trained to hunt escaped slaves. They came to watch a spectacle that their host, Colonel Marcus Whitmore, had promised would be unlike anything they had ever seen. The prey, Whitmore announced with a showman's flourish, would be an African giant, a savage captured from the dark jungles of the Congo, a creature more animal than man who would provide excellent sport, before being brought down like the beast he was. What happened over the next 48 hours would become legend in Louisiana, but not the kind of legend Whitmore intended. By the time the sun rose on the third day, 3 of the hunters were dead. 7 more were injured, so severely they would never fully recover. Colonel Marcus Whitmore himself was found tied to a cypress tree in his own swamp, weeping and begging for mercy, surrounded by every enslaved person he had brutalized for years. And the African giant was gone, vanished into the wilderness with 43 men, women, and children who should have been free 4 years earlier, but had been kept in chains through fraud and violence, and the willful blindness of a nation that had grown tired of fighting for justice. This is the true story of Jabari, the hunter who became the hunted, who became the hunter once again. It is a story of survival and revenge, of courage and cunning, of a man who was underestimated by everyone who met him, and who made them pay for that mistake in ways they could never have imagined. It begins not in Louisiana, but 6,000 miles away in a village on the banks of the Congo River in the autumn of 1868. The village was called Inanza, and it had existed in that location for more than 300 years. The people who lived there were part of the Congo Kingdom, one of the most sophisticated civilizations in Central Africa, with a written language, a complex system of government and trade networks that stretched across the continent. They were farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and scholars, warriors and priests. They had survived Portuguese colonization, the slave trade that had depleted their population for centuries, and the constant pressure of neighboring kingdoms seeking to expand their territory. Jabari was born in Mbanza in 1852, the 3rd son of a man named Ken, who held the title of war chief. In the hierarchy of the village, this made Jabari royalty, though not in line for leadership. His older brothers would inherit their father's responsibilities. Jabari's path was different. From the age of 7, he was trained as a hunter. This was not a casual education. Among the Congo people, hunters occupied a special position in society. They provided meat for the community. They protected the village from predators. They ranged far into the wilderness, learning its secrets, mapping its dangers, becoming intimate with the forest in ways that ordinary people never could. A skilled hunter was worth more than a dozen warriors because he could operate alone, survive in conditions that would kill others, and accomplish tasks that required patience and intelligence rather than brute force. Jabari excelled at the training. By the time he was 12, he had killed his first leopard, tracking the animal for 3 days through dense jungle before cornering it in a ravine and dispatching it with a single spear thrust. By 14, he had faced a forest elephant that was terrorizing outlying farms, driving the massive creature away from human settlement through a combination of fire, noise, and strategic positioning that demonstrated a tactical mind far beyond his years. By 16, he was considered one of the finest hunters in the region, sought after by neighboring villages to deal with problem animals, and consulted by his father on matters of strategy and defense. He was also, by the standards of his people and any other, physically extraordinary. Jabari stood 57 in tall, a height that would have been remarkable anywhere in the world, but was almost unheard of in the mid-9th century, when average male height was closer to 5'6". His body was layered with muscle developed over years of running through forests, climbing trees, carrying heavy loads across difficult terrain. His shoulders were broad enough that he had to turn sideways to enter most doorways. His hands could span a grown man's skull. But what made Jabari truly formidable was not his size. It was his mind. He had inherited his father's gift for tactical thinking, the ability to see a situation from multiple angles, to anticipate what an opponent would do before they did it, to plan 3 or 4 moves ahead, while appearing to act on instinct. This gift served him well in hunting, where the difference between success and failure, between life and death, often came down to predicting how an animal would react to pressure. It would serve him even better in Louisiana, where the animals he hunted walked on 2 legs and considered themselves the masters of creation. The capture happened in October of 1868. By that point, the Atlantic slave trade had been officially illegal for decades. The United States had banned the importation of slaves in 1808. Britain had spent enormous resources patrolling the African coast to intercept slave ships. International pressure had forced most European nations to abandon the practice, but laws on paper do not always translate to reality on the ground. In the chaos following the American Civil War, with federal attention focused on Reconstruction and the integration of 4 million formerly enslaved people into American society, some opportunists saw a chance to make money. The demand for labor in the Deep South remained high. The supply of workers willing to accept the conditions offered by former slaveholders was low, and there were always men willing to break laws if the profit was sufficient. A consortium of investors based in New Orleans had established a smuggling operation that brought captured Africans through Cuba, where Spanish colonial authorities could be bribed to look the other way, and then into the Louisiana Bayous through routes that avoided federal patrols. The operation was small, no more than a few hundred people per year, but it was profitable enough to attract serious money and serious protection. The capture team that arrived in Jabari's region consisted of 12 men, a mix of Portuguese traders, Arab middlemen, and African collaborators from rival tribes. They had been operating in the area for several months, taking people from isolated farms and small villages, avoiding larger settlements that could mount effective resistance. Amba was too large to attack directly, but the capture team was patient. They watched. They waited. They identified vulnerabilities. They found one in Jabari's younger sister, Amara. Amara was 15 years old, beautiful, and like many teenage girls, prone to wandering farther from the village than safety allowed. She had a favorite spot by a waterfall 2 miles from Ambassa, a place where she went to be alone, to think, to escape the pressures of being the daughter of the war chief. The capture team took her on a Tuesday afternoon. When Jabari learned what had happened, he did what any brother would do. He tracked the team through the forest, following signs that others would have missed, moving faster than men burdened with captives could move. He caught up with them at their camp 12 miles from just as the sun was setting. He could have attacked. He was armed with his hunting spear and a knife, and he was confident in his ability to kill several of them, before being overwhelmed. But Amara was tied to a tree in the center of the camp, a knife at her throat held by a man who was clearly prepared to use it. The leader of the capture team, a Portuguese trader named Ferreira, made Jabari an offer. Surrender and Amara goes free. Fight, and she dies before you reach her. Jabari looked at his sister. He looked at the knife. He looked at the 12 men surrounding him, their weapons ready, their eyes eager for the profit that his capture would bring. He dropped his spear. Ferreira kept his word, after a fashion. Amara was released, given a head start of several hours before anyone could pursue her. She made it back to Mbanza. She told her father what had happened. Search parties were sent out, but by then Jabari was already on a ship, chained in a hold with 40 other captives, sailing west toward a fate he could not imagine. The journey took 11 weeks. Jabari would not speak of it in detail, not then, not ever. The historical record tells us what such journeys were like. Hundreds of people packed into spaces designed for cargo, not human beings. Disease spreading through the holds like fire through dry grass. Death rates that could reach 30 or 40% before the ship reached its destination. The constant darkness. The suffocating heat. The sounds and smells of human suffering compressed into a space too small to comprehend. What we know about Jabari's specific experience comes from fragments. Things he mentioned in passing to people he trusted in the years that followed. We know that he was kept separate from the other captives for most of the voyage, chained alone in a small compartment near the captain's quarters. We know that this was because of his size, which made the crew nervous, and because Ferreira had already identified him as valuable cargo that needed to be delivered in good condition. We know that he was fed better than the others, given water more frequently, allowed on deck occasionally for air and exercise. We also know that he used every moment of relative freedom to observe. He watched how the ship operated. He learned the rhythms of the crew when they changed watches, when they slept, when they were alert, and when they were careless. He studied the ocean, the stars, the patterns of wind and current that the sailors used to navigate. He listened to conversations in Portuguese and Spanish and English, languages he did not speak, but began to understand through context and repetition. He was preparing for what he did not yet know, but he was preparing. The ship arrived in Cuba in January of 1869. The captives were transferred to a holding facility outside Havana, where they were cleaned, fed, and prepared for sail. Jabari spent 3 weeks in that facility, watched constantly by guards who had been warned about his size and potential danger. The buyer who purchased him was an American named Theodore Marsh, a broker who specialized in supplying labor to Louisiana plantations. Marsh paid $400 for Jabari, twice the going rate for a healthy adult male, because he knew that Colonel Marcus Whitmore had specifically requested an African of unusual size and strength. Whitmore had plans for such a man, plans that he had described to Marsh in detail during a meeting in New Orleans 2 months earlier. The colonel wanted a spectacle. Marcus Whitmore was 53 years old in 1869. He had been born into one of the wealthiest families in Louisiana, heir to a cotton empire that had been built over 3 generations through the labor of enslaved people. He had attended West Point, served with distinction in the Mexican-American War, and risen to the rank of colonel in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. He had never accepted the South's defeat. He had never accepted emancipation, and he had certainly never accepted the idea that the people who had worked his family's land for a century were now legally free to leave. Whitmore's plantation, called Belmont, covered 12,000 acres along the banks of Bayou Lush. Before the war, it had been worked by over 300 enslaved people. After the war, The federal government had required Whitmore to free those people and either hire them as paid laborers or let them go. Whitmore had done neither. Instead, he had created a system of control that maintained slavery in everything but name. Workers were told they owed debts for housing, food, clothing, and tools. These debts were calculated in ways that ensured they could never be paid off. Workers who tried to leave were told they would be arrested for theft. If they did not settle their accounts first, those who persisted were visited at night by men in masks who beat them, burned their homes, or simply made them disappear. The local sheriff was Whitmore's cousin. The local judge had served under Whitmore in the war. The federal officials responsible for enforcing Reconstruction laws in the region had been bribed, threatened, or simply ignored complaints because they lacked the resources to investigate every report of abuse in a state where abuse was epidemic. By 1869, Whitmore had effectively recreated the plantation system of the antebellum South, with 217 people living and working on his land under conditions indistinguishable from slavery. But Whitmore was not satisfied with mere control. He wanted to make a statement. The war had humiliated him. The occupation had humiliated him. The sight of black men in Union uniforms, of former slaves voting and holding office, of a world turned upside down, all of it burned in his gut like acid. He needed to demonstrate to himself and to his peers that the natural order still existed, that white men were still the masters, that black people were still animals to be used and discarded. An African giant would serve that purpose perfectly. Whitmore imagined a creature from the jungle, savage and uncivilized, proof that black people were fundamentally different from whites, fundamentally inferior, fundamentally suited only for labor and servitude. He would display this creature to his friends. He would demonstrate his power over it. And eventually, when the novelty wore off, he would hunt it. The hunt was the culmination of his fantasy. A return to the old days when planters would pursue escaped slaves through the swamps with dogs and guns. When the chase was sport and the capture was entertainment. Whitmore had participated in such hunts before the war. He missed them. He wanted to experience that thrill again. And he wanted to share it with others who felt as he did. Jabari arrived at Belmont in February of 1869. He was transported from New Orleans in a wagon cage, the kind used for dangerous animals. His wrists and ankles chained, his neck secured by an iron collar attached to the cage bars. The journey took 2 days. Jabari spent that time watching the landscape, memorizing landmarks, noting the direction of the sun and the flow of water in the streams they crossed. When the wagon arrived at Belmont, a crowd had gathered to see it. Whitmore had announced the arrival of his African giant, and every white person on the property, along with many from neighboring plantations, had come to witness the spectacle. Jabari was pulled from the cage and made to stand in the yard in front of the main house. His chains were adjusted so that he could walk, but not run. His clothes, what remained of them after the voyage and the transport, were stripped away, leaving him naked before the crowd. Whitmore circled him like a buyer at a horse auction, pointing out his height, his musculature, the ritual scars on his chest that marked him as a member of his father's lineage. The crowd murmured and gasped. Some of the women covered their eyes. Some of the men made jokes that drew laughter. Through all of it, Jabari remained still. His face showed nothing. His eyes, when they moved at all, moved slowly, taking in faces and positions, cataloging information that might be useful later. Whitmore stopped in front of him and looked up. The colonel was tall for his generation, nearly 6 feet, but Jabari towered over him by more than half a foot. "Do you understand English?" Whitmore asked. Jabari said nothing. "Can you speak at all? Or do your kind just grunt like the apes you are?" Jabari said nothing. Whitmore smiled. He had expected this. Savages from the deep jungle would not know civilized languages. That was part of the appeal. The utter foreignness of the creature, its complete separation from the world of educated white men. "Take him to the quarters," Whitmore ordered. "Chain him in the large cabin. I want 4 men watching him at all times. If he tries anything, shoot him in the legs. I want him alive, but I don't need him mobile." The guards led Jabari away. The crowd dispersed, chattering about what they had seen, already spreading stories that would grow more exaggerated with each telling. The African giant had arrived. The entertainment was about to begin. What no one understood, what no one could have understood, was that the entertainment had already begun. But the audience and the performer were not who they appeared to be. Jabari was placed in a cabin at the edge of the slave quarters, a structure that had once housed a family of 6, and now contained only him and the guards assigned to watch him. The cabin had 1 door and 2 windows, both barred. His ankle chain was attached to a ring bolted into the floor, giving him about 1/10 of movement in any direction. For the first week, he did nothing but watch. He watched the guards, learning their names, their habits, their weaknesses. There were 12 men assigned to him in rotating shifts of 4, and within days he knew which ones drank on duty, which ones fell asleep, which ones were cruel for pleasure, and which were merely doing a job. He learned that the shift change happened at 6000 in the morning and 6000 in the evening, and that the 10 minutes during the change were the only times when fewer than 4 men were present. He watched the other workers through the cabin windows, observing the rhythms of plantation life, the movement of people and materials, the locations of tools and supplies. He saw where the overseers stationed themselves during the day and where they went at night. He saw which paths were used frequently and which were abandoned. He listened to everything. The guards talked freely in front of him, assuming he could not understand. They complained about their pay, their treatment, their women. They gossiped about Whitmore and his plans, about the other planters in the region, about politics and money, and all the small concerns that filled their days. They spoke about the workers using words that Jabari filed away for future reference, revealing information about personalities and relationships that would prove valuable later. Most importantly, they spoke about the hunt. It was scheduled for August. They said Whitmore had already sent invitations to a dozen of his friends, wealthy planters and former Confederate officers who shared his views and his appetites. The African giant would be released into the swamp north of the plantation, given a head start of 1 hour, and then pursued by men on horseback with dogs and rifles. The first man to bring down the prey would receive a prize of 500. The body would be displayed in New Orleans as proof of the savage nature of the African race. Jabari listened to all of this with no visible reaction. The guards interpreted his silence as incomprehension. They were wrong. During those early weeks, something else happened that would change everything. Jabari met the other workers. They came to his cabin in small groups, brought by guards, who wanted to display the African giant to their colleagues, or who simply wanted to see the reactions of the enslaved people to this creature from across the ocean. The workers looked at Jabari with expressions that ranged from fear to curiosity to something that might have been hope. One worker was different. His name was Solomon, and he was 63 years old. Born on Belmont, when it was still called by its original French name, raised under Whitmore's father. Survivor of 6 decades of slavery, Solomon had seen everything there was to see. He had watched families torn apart, children sold away from mothers, men beaten to death for minor infractions. He had outlived 2 wives and 4 children. The wives dead of exhaustion and disease. The children sold to distant plantations from which no word ever came. Solomon should have been broken by any reasonable measure. He should have been empty, hollowed out by grief and suffering, reduced to the shuffling compliance that the system was designed to create. He was not. Something in Solomon had survived. Call it faith. Call it stubbornness. Call it the simple human refusal to surrender entirely to despair. Whatever it was, it burned in his eyes. The same quality that overseers had seen in Jabari's eyes. The quality that marked someone as dangerous. Solomon came to Jabari's cabin on the 3rd night, after the guards had fallen into their usual patterns of inattention. He stood outside the window, invisible in the darkness, and spoke softly through the bars. "You understand, don't you?" he said. It was not a question. Jabari turned to look at him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. "I've seen that look before," Solomon continued. "In men who were planning something, in men who weren't going to accept what was happening to them." He paused. "Those men are all dead now. The ones who tried to fight, the ones who tried to run. Whitmore killed them all." Still, Jabari said nothing. "But you're different," Solomon said. "I can feel it. You're not scared. You're not even angry, not really. You're thinking, planning, waiting." He moved closer to the bars, his voice dropping even lower. "Whatever you're planning, I want to help. We all do. Everyone here. We've been waiting for someone for years. Maybe you're what we've been waiting for." Jabari looked at the old man for a long time. Then, for the first time since his arrival at Belmont, he spoke. "Tell me everything," he said. His English was heavily accented but clear. He had been listening, learning, absorbing the language through weeks of immersion, the same way he had absorbed Portuguese and Spanish on the ship. His mind, trained for tracking and analysis, had mapped the grammar and vocabulary of English onto the framework of his native tongue, creating a functional, if imperfect, translation. Solomon stared at him, momentarily shocked. Then he smiled, the first genuine smile he had allowed himself in years. "I will," he said. "I'll tell you everything." Over the following weeks, Solomon became Jabari's primary source of intelligence about Belmont. The old man visited the cabin regularly, always at night, always when the guards were distracted or asleep, and he told Jabari everything he knew. He told him about the layout of the plantation, the 12 zallows and acres that stretched from the bayou to the swamp, the fields and forests and waterways that crisscrossed the property. He told him about the main house where Whitmore lived with his wife and 2 sons, about the overseer's quarters, about the stables and the kennels and the armory where weapons were stored. He told him about the people, the 217 workers who were held at Belmont against their will, their names and ages and skills and relationships. He told him which ones could be trusted absolutely, and which might break under pressure. He told him about the natural leaders who had emerged despite the system's attempt to crush all leadership. The men and women who kept hope alive through whispered conversations and small acts of resistance. He told him about Whitmore, the colonel's habits, his schedule, his weaknesses, his addiction to laudanum, which he took every night to help him sleep, his temper, which flared unpredictably and had led to beatings that left workers crippled or dead, his arrogance, which convinced him that he was smarter than everyone around him, that he had thought of everything, that no one could possibly outmaneuver him. And he told him about the swamp. The swamp was the key. Whitmore planned to release Jabari into the swamp for the hunt, confident that an African jungle dweller would be helpless in the unfamiliar terrain, easy prey for men who knew the land. Whitmore was wrong. Solomon described the swamp in detail, having worked there as a young man cutting cypress for lumber. He drew maps in the dirt outside Jabari's window, showing the channels and islands, the high ground and the quicksand, the places where a man could hide and the places where a man would die. He explained which plants were edible and which were poison, which animals were dangerous and which were merely frightening, how to navigate by the stars when the water and the trees made ordinary landmarks useless. Jabari absorbed it all. The swamp is not so different from the jungle. He told Solomon one night, water and trees and predators. I have lived in such places all my life. Whitmore thinks he is sending me into a trap. He is sending me home. Solomon nodded slowly. Then you have a chance. But a chance ain't enough. There is 12 men with guns and dogs. You'll be unarmed. Even if you know the land, they'll run you down eventually. Perhaps, Jabari said, if I am the prey, but what if I am the hunter? Solomon looked at him, not understanding. I have killed leopards, Jabari continued. Lions. Animals that are faster and stronger than any man. Do you know how I did it? Solomon shook his head. I did not chase them. I did not fight them on their terms. I studied them. I learned their patterns. I found their weaknesses, and then I created situations where their strengths became weaknesses, where their confidence became a trap. He smiled, the first smile anyone at Belrive Manor had seen from him. These men who will hunt me, they are confident. They believe they are the predators and I am the prey. That belief is their weakness. I will use it against them. How? Jabari told him. That took shape over months of whispered conversations and careful preparation. It was complex, requiring coordination among dozens of people who had been taught their entire lives that resistance was futile and cooperation was death. It required the acquisition of supplies that were closely guarded, the creation of hiding places that would not be discovered, the development of signals and codes that could be used without alerting the overseers. It also required Jabari to do something that went against every instinct he had developed as a hunter. He had to be patient. The hunt was scheduled for August. It was now March, 5 months of waiting, of enduring daily humiliations, of maintaining the fiction of incomprehension and docility, while Whitmore and his men congratulated themselves on having captured such a magnificent specimen of African savagery. Jabari waited. He waited while Whitmore brought visitors to gawk at him. Rich men and their wives who poked at him with canes and made comments about his anatomy that they would never have made about a white man. He waited while the guards amused themselves by throwing food at him, like he was an animal in a zoo, laughing when he ate from the floor, because they had taken away his hands' freedom. He waited while Whitmore himself came night after night to sit in a chair outside the cabin and talk about the hunt, describing in detail what would happen, how Jabari would be chased through the swamp, how he would be shot and skinned and displayed as a trophy. Through all of it, Jabari showed nothing. His face remained blank. His eyes revealed nothing except the careful observation that his captors mistook for animal vacancy. He played the role they expected him to play. The savage beast too stupid to understand his fate, too broken to resist it. But inside he was counting the days, and he was preparing. Solomon was not the only ally Jabari cultivated during those months. There was a woman named Ruth who worked in the main house who had access to the family's schedule and the location of keys and weapons. There was a man named Isaiah who worked in the stables, who knew the horses and dogs, who could predict how they would behave under different conditions. There was a teenager named Daniel who ran messages between the fields and the house, who could move around the plantation without attracting suspicion. Each of them was recruited carefully, tested for reliability, brought into the plan only when Jabari was certain they could be trusted. Each of them had their own reasons for wanting to fight back, their own histories of loss and suffering, their own burning desire to see Whitmore pay for what he had done. Jabari did not promise them revenge. He promised them something more valuable: freedom. The plan was not just about surviving the hunt. It was not just about killing the men who came to kill him. It was about liberation, about breaking the chains that held 217 people in bondage, about creating an opportunity for escape that would never come again. The hunt would draw Whitmore and his friends away from the plantation. It would focus their attention on the swamp, on the chase, on the sport they had come to enjoy. While they were distracted, while they were deep in the wilderness pursuing what they thought was prey, the workers would act. They would seize the weapons in the armory. They would neutralize the guards who remained behind. They would gather supplies and animals, and everything they needed to survive a long journey. And then they would leave, heading north toward Kansas, toward territory where slavery had never taken root, and where a community of freed people was building a new life. It was a desperate plan. It required everything to go right and nothing to go wrong. It required ordinary people to become soldiers overnight, to risk their lives on the slim chance that a giant African stranger could defeat a dozen armed men in an unfamiliar swamp. But it was also the only plan they had, and when Solomon presented it to the others one by one, in whispered meetings held in the dead of night, not a single person refused. They were ready to fight. They had been ready for years. They just needed someone to show told how. The months passed slowly. Jabari used the time to train. He could not exercise openly, not with guards watching, but he found ways to maintain his strength and conditioning within the constraints of his chains. He developed a routine of isometric exercises, tensing and releasing muscles against the resistance of his own body, building power that would be invisible to observers. He practiced moving silently within his 10-foot radius, learning to control his breath and his footsteps until he could cross the cabin floor without making a sound. He also trained his mind. Every night after the guards had settled into their evening routine, Jabari would close his eyes and walk through the swamp in his imagination, using Solomon's descriptions and the maps drawn in the dirt. He created a mental picture of the terrain so vivid that he could navigate it without sight. He visualized the hunt, imagining different scenarios, different positions, different responses. He planned for contingencies, for things going wrong, for situations that would require improvisation. He remembered his father's teachings. A hunter does not just kill. A hunter understands. He understands the land and the prey in himself. He understands that patience is more valuable than speed, that intelligence is more valuable than strength, that victory goes not to the fastest or the strongest, but to the one who thinks most clearly when everything is chaos. Jabari understood. He also understood something else, something that his captives would never have believed possible. He was not alone. Word of the African giant had spread through the network of enslaved people that connected plantations across Louisiana. Messages passed from worker to worker, plantation to plantation. An underground telegraph made of whispers and coded songs and scraps of paper hidden in clothing. People Jabari would never meet knew about him, knew about the hunt, knew that something was being planned, and they were helping. Small things mostly. A guard at a neighboring plantation who mentioned to his enslaved valet that Whitmore's dogs were trained to follow blood. A house servant in New Orleans who overheard her master discussing the hunt and passed along details about who would attend and what weapons they would bring. A boatman on the bayou who provided information about water levels and current patterns that would affect movement through the swamp. Each piece of information found its way to Solomon, who found his way to Jabari's window in the darkness. By August, Jabari knew more about the hunt than many of the participants did. He knew the names of the 12 men who would pursue him. He knew their reputations, their skills, their weaknesses. He knew which ones were experienced hunters and which were wealthy dilettantes seeking a thrill. He knew which ones were dangerous and which were merely cruel. He knew that Whitmore had purchased special ammunition for the occasion, bullets designed to wound rather than kill, to bring down the prey without destroying it completely. The colonel wanted his trophy alive if possible, wanted the opportunity to deliver the final blow himself in front of witnesses who would spread the story across the South. He knew that the dogs, a pack of 6 mastiffs bred for tracking escaped slaves, would be released 30 minutes after Jabari entered the swamp, giving the prey a chance to create distance before the real pursuit began. He knew that the men would follow on horseback until the terrain became impassable, then continue on foot, spreading out in a line to cover more ground. He knew that no one expected him to survive the first hour. They were wrong. The morning of August 14th dawned hot and humid, the air so thick with moisture that breathing felt like drowning. Jabari had been awake since before dawn, running through the plan in his mind one final time, checking each element against the preparations that had been made over the previous months. At 700, guards came to his cabin and removed his chains. They replaced them with lighter restraints, a single rope around his wrist that could be cut quickly when the hunt began. They gave him clothes, rough cotton pants and a shirt, the first real clothing he had worn since arriving at Beaumont. They gave him a water bottle and a knife. The knife was a surprise. Whitmore had decided that sporting spirit required giving the prey some chance of defense, however minimal. The blade was dull and the handle was loose, nearly useless for actual combat. But Jabari accepted it without comment. He had no intention of using it for fighting. He had other plans for the knife. They led him out of the cabin and across the plantation to the northern boundary, where the cultivated land ended and the swamp began. A crowd had gathered to see him off, workers forced to witness the spectacle, and white visitors eager for entertainment. Whitmore stood at the front of the crowd, dressed in hunting clothes, a rifle over his shoulder, and a smile on his face. "Today, gentlemen, we hunt the most dangerous game," he announced. An African savage fresh from the jungles of the Congo, armed only with his primitive instincts against the superior skills of civilized men. He paused for effect. "I give him 1 hour before the dogs find him, 2 hours before he's brought down. Who wants to take that bet?" Laughter from the crowd. Money changed hands as men wagered on how long the hunt would last. Whitmore turned to Jabari. "Do you have anything to say, savage? Any last words before you run for your pathetic life?" Jabari looked at him. For the first time since his arrival at Beaumont, he let something show in his eyes. Not fear, not anger, something else. Contempt. "I will see you soon," he said. The words were clear, the English precise. Whitmore's smile faltered just for a moment before he recovered his composure. "So, the beast can speak after all," he said. "How delightful. It will make the trophy even more valuable when we mount your head on my wall." He gestured to the guards. "Release him. Let the hunt begin." The rope around Jabari's wrists was cut. The crowd parted to create a path toward the swamp. Jabari walked forward slowly, deliberately, refusing to run like the frightened prey they expected. At the edge of the trees, he stopped and turned back. Every eye was on him. The workers, the visitors, the guards, Whitmore himself. All of them watching, waiting, expecting him to flee into the darkness of the swamp. Jabari raised one hand and pointed directly at Whitmore. Then he vanished into the trees. The swamp swallowed him whole. The moment Jabari crossed into the swamp, he changed. On the plantation he had been a captive, a specimen, a creature on display for the amusement of cruel men. He had shuffled and stared and played the role they expected. The savage too stupid to understand his fate. He had endured their mockery and their violence, and their casual dehumanization without reaction, without resistance, without revealing anything of what lay beneath the surface. Now he was home. Not Louisiana, not this specific swamp, but the world of water and trees and shadow that he had known since childhood. The principles were the same in the Congo jungle and the Louisiana bayou. Move quietly, stay hidden, use the terrain. Think like the prey to anticipate the predator. Think like the predator to become something worse. Jabari moved through the swamp with a speed and silence that would have astonished anyone watching. His bare feet found solid ground, where others would have sunk into mud. His body slipped through gaps in the vegetation that seemed too narrow for a man his size. Within 10 minutes, he had covered half a mile. Within 20, he had reached the first position Solomon had described, a small island of high ground surrounded by water too deep for horses and too murky for dogs to track through. He stopped there and began to prepare. The knife Whitmore had given him was nearly useless as a weapon, but Jabari had not planned to use it that way. He used it now to cut strips from his shirt, creating cordage that he wove into simple snares. He used it to sharpen sticks into points, creating stakes that he concealed in the mud along the approaches to the island. He used it to harvest vines that he would later use for other purposes. While he worked, he listened. The swamp was alive with sound. Birds calling, insects buzzing, frogs croaking. The constant drip and splash of water moving through the maze of channels. But beneath those natural sounds, Jabari could hear others. The distant barking of dogs, the shouts of men, the noise of a hunting party that believed invincible. That made no effort at stealth, because it never occurred to them that stealth might be necessary. They were coming. 30 minutes had passed since his release. The dogs would be in the swamp now, searching for his scent, leading the hunters toward their prey. Jabari smiled. He had left a scent trail, of course. A clear path from the edge of the swamp to a point about a 4th mile in, where the ground became unstable and the water grew deep. Anyone following that trail would find themselves in a maze of channels that led nowhere, burning time and energy while Jabari circled around behind them. But that was only the first layer of the plan. The real preparation had happened months ago, in whispered conversations through cabin windows, and supplies hidden in locations throughout the swamp, in knowledge accumulated from Solomon and Isaiah and dozens of others who had contributed what they knew. Jabari was not just surviving, he was hunting. The first man died at 11:43 in the morning. His name was Robert Callahan and he was 41 years old. A plantation owner from Ascension Parish who had come to the hunt because he was bored with his life and eager for excitement. He had been a Confederate cavalry officer during the war, a position that had convinced him of his own martial prowess, despite the fact that he had never actually killed anyone in combat. He rode a fine horse, carried an expensive rifle, and wore clothing specially tailored for the occasion. He also had a habit of riding ahead of the group, eager to be the first to spot the prey, imagining the glory of being the one to bring down the African giant. This habit killed him. Jabari had positioned himself in a cypress tree, overlooking one of the main channels, invisible among the Spanish moss that draped the branches. He had watched the hunting party enter the swamp, had observed their formation, had noted which riders stayed close together and which ventured out on their own. Callahan was the obvious choice. When the man rode beneath the tree, Jabari dropped. It was not a long fall, perhaps 12 feet, but Jabari used every inch of it. He landed on Callahan's back with his full weight, driving the man from the saddle and into the shallow water below. The impact stunned Callahan, knocked the breath from his lungs, gave Jabari the fraction of a second he needed. One hand clamped over Callahan's mouth. The other found the knife at the man's belt, a proper hunting knife with a sharp blade and a solid handle. The knife opened Callahan's throat before he could make a sound. The horse, panicked by the sudden violence, bolted down the channel. The noise of its flight would draw attention, but by then Jabari would be gone, carrying Callahan's rifle, his ammunition, his knife, and his water canteen. He left the body floating in the channel face down, a message to whoever found it. The prey had teeth. The second man died at 1:15 in the afternoon. His name was James Thornton, and he was 37 years old, a lawyer from Baton Rouge who had no business being on a hunt of any kind. He was overweight, out of shape, terrified of the swamp, and present only because his father-in-law, one of Whitmore's closest friends, had insisted he come to prove his manhood. Thornton had become separated from the group when his horse refused to cross a particularly deep channel. While he struggled with the animal, shouting for help that did not come, Jabari emerged from the water behind him, like a creature from nightmare. Thornton never saw what killed him. He felt a hand close around his ankle, felt himself pulled from the saddle, felt water close over his head. He struggled briefly before unconsciousness took him. He never woke up. Jabari held him under until the bubbles stopped, then released the body to float downstream. He took the man's pistol, a Colt Navy revolver with 6 rounds in the cylinder, and disappeared back into the water. The hunting party found Thornton's body 40 minutes later tangled in roots at the edge of a channel. The discovery changed the mood of the hunt entirely. This was no longer sport. This was war. Whitmore gathered his remaining men on a patch of high ground and assessed the situation. 2 dead, both killed silently and efficiently, their weapons taken. The dogs were confused, circling unable to hold a scent in the watery terrain. The horses were nervous, sensing the fear of their riders becoming difficult to control. Some of the hunters wanted to leave. This was not what they had signed up for. A chase through the swamp, a ceremonial kill, a trophy to brag about, not this, not actual danger, not the possibility that they might be the ones who ended up dead. Whitmore refused. "He's one man," the colonel said, his voice tight with fury. "One savage with stolen weapons. We are 12 trained men with superior firepower. We do not run from animals. We hunt them down and we kill them. He's killed 2 of us already," someone pointed out. "Through trickery, through ambush, through the kind of primitive cunning that any wild beast possesses." Whitmore's eyes scanned the swamp looking for movement, looking for anything. "He cannot face us directly. He knows he would lose, so we force him to face us. We spread out. We close in from all sides. We give him no room to maneuver. And when we corner him, we put him down like the dog he is." The plan was sound from a military perspective against a conventional enemy. It might have worked, but Whitmore was not fighting a conventional enemy. He was fighting a man who had killed lions by understanding how they thought, who had survived capture by understanding how his captors thought, who understood the minds of men far better than they understood his. The hunters spread out as ordered, forming a loose circle that would contract toward the center of the swamp. They moved slowly, carefully, watching for signs of ambush, calling out to maintain contact with each other. The dogs ranged ahead, still searching for scent, still confused by the water and the mud. Jabari watched them from a hidden position 300 yards away. He had anticipated this response. He had planned for it, and he knew exactly what to do. The third man died at 3:47 in the afternoon. His name was William Prescott, and he was the most dangerous of the hunters, a former Confederate sharpshooter who had killed more than 30 Union soldiers during the war. Prescott was calm, experienced, and genuinely skilled with his rifle. If anyone in the group was capable of spotting Jabari before Jabari spotted him, it was Prescott. So, Jabari killed him first. He did it from distance using Callahan's rifle, firing from a concealed position across a channel that was too wide for accurate return fire. The bullet took Prescott in the chest, dropping him instantly. By the time the other hunters reached his position, Jabari was a fourth mile away, moving through channels too shallow for pursuit. 3 dead, 3 hours. The arithmetic was becoming impossible to ignore. At 40:30, 2 of the remaining hunters announced they were leaving. They had come for entertainment, not suicide. They would take their chances with the swamp, rather than continue a hunt that had become a slaughter. Whitmore let them go. He could not force them to stay, and their fear was becoming contagious, spreading to the others, undermining the confidence he needed to maintain. Better to let the cowards leave than to have them panic at a critical moment. 7 hunters remained. Whitmore, his 2 sons, and 4 others who were either too proud or too stupid to quit. The sun was beginning to set. In an hour, the swamp would be dark, and in darkness, every advantage would shift to the prey. The hunters had lanterns, but lanterns created light that could be seen from a distance, light that would reveal their positions while hiding their quarry. Whitmore made a decision. "We camp here tonight," he announced. "Build fires, establish a perimeter. We'll have 2 men on watch at all times. In the morning, we resume the hunt with fresh eyes and clear heads." It was a reasonable decision. It was also exactly what Jabari expected. The hunters made camp on a small island, the largest patch of dry ground in their immediate area. They built fires to keep away the mosquitoes and the night creatures. They posted sentries at opposite ends of the island. They ate cold rations and drank from their canteens and tried not to think about the 3 bodies floating somewhere in the darkness. Jabari watched them from a position in the trees 60 yards away. Invisible in the darkness that was his natural element. He had eaten 2 food from one of the supply caches that Solomon had established months ago. He had rested briefly in a hidden shelter that no one would ever find. He was ready for what came next. But first, he had other business to attend to. At 1100 that night, while the hunters huddled around their fires and jumped at every sound, a different kind of action was taking place at Belmont. Solomon had been waiting for this moment for months. He had rehearsed it in his mind 1,000 times, had gone over every detail with the others who would participate, had prepared for contingencies and disasters, and everything that could possibly go wrong. When the signal came, a lantern flashed 3 times from the tree line. He moved. The armory was guarded by 2 men overseers who had been left behind. When Whitmore took the primary security force to the hunt, they were playing cards, drinking whiskey, confident that the workers would never dare to resist. They had beaten resistance out of these people years ago. They had nothing to fear from a bunch of broken slaves. Solomon approached them openly, shuffling head down, the posture of submission they expected. He told them he had a message from the main house, something about the hunt, something urgent. The guards looked at each other, annoyed at the interruption, but they let him approach. He was within arm's reach when Isaiah came through the back door. Isaiah was 43 years old and had worked in the stables since he was 12. He knew every horse on the plantation, knew how to calm them, and how to excite them, knew how to move among large, dangerous animals without being hurt. He also knew how to move silently, and he carried a hammer he had taken from the blacksmith's shed. The first guard died before he knew he was in danger. The second managed to shout once before Solomon's hands closed around his throat. The shout brought others running, workers who had been waiting in the shadows, who swarmed the armory and secured the weapons inside. Within 15 minutes, the remaining guards at Belmont had been neutralized. Some were killed, others were locked in the very cabins that had held enslaved people for generations. None escaped to warn Whitmore. Ruth, who had worked in the main house for 20 years, led a group to secure Whitmore's wife and sons. The wife, a frail woman named Elizabeth, who had never shown any kindness to the workers, fainted when she saw armed black men in her bedroom. The sons, teenagers who had inherited their father's arrogance, but not his physical courage, surrendered without resistance. By midnight, Belmont was in the hands of its workers. Solomon gathered everyone in the yard in front of the main house, 217 people who had lived their entire lives under the control of the Whitmore family. He looked at their faces, saw fear and hope and disbelief mixing together, and he told them what came next. "We're leaving," he said, "all of us tonight. We're heading north to Kansas, where free people have built communities that welcome folks like us." He paused, letting the words sink in. "It's a long journey, 500 mech, maybe more. There'll be danger every step of the way, but I'd rather die free on that road than live another day under any white man's boot." He asked if anyone wanted to stay. No one did. They took everything they could carry: food from the storehouses, clothing from the main house, weapons from the armory, horses and mules from the stables. They loaded wagons with supplies that would sustain them for weeks. They gathered children who were too young to understand what was happening and elders who were too old to travel fast, but would not be left behind. At 200 in the morning, the exodus began. They headed northwest following routes that Solomon had identified months ago. Paths that avoided main roads and white settlements, trails through forests and along rivers that would hide their passage. They moved as quickly as they could with wagons and animals, and people of all ages, knowing that every hour of head start was precious, knowing that pursuit would come eventually behind them. Belmont burned. Ruth had suggested it and Solomon had agreed. The main house, the overseer's quarters, the gin and the presses, everything that represented Whitmore's power and wealth. Let it burn. Let him return to ashes. Let him know that his world was gone, destroyed by the people he had called animals. The flames rose into the night sky, visible for miles, a beacon announcing that something had changed, something that could never be unchanged. In the swamp, Jabari saw the glow on the horizon. He smiled. Phase 1 was complete. Now came Phase 2. The hunters woke to the smell of smoke. At first, they thought it was their own fires dying down in the pre-dawn darkness. Then someone looked south and saw the orange glow, and panic spread through the camp like fever. "That's Belmont," Whitmore said, his voice hollow. "That's my home." He wanted to leave immediately, to rush back to the plantation to save whatever could be saved. But the swamp was between him and home. Miles of treacherous terrain that had already killed 3 of his men. And somewhere in that terrain, the African giant was waiting. They argued. Some wanted to go back. Some wanted to continue the hunt to kill the savage who had caused all this, to have at least that victory to show for the disaster. Some wanted to split up, half going back and half staying. In the end, they did the worst possible thing. They hesitated. While they argued, while they debated, while they tried to decide what to do, Jabari moved. He had positioned himself during the night, circling around to the south side of their camp, placing himself between the hunters and their path home. He had prepared the ground, creating obstacles that would slow pursuit, establishing fallback positions in case things went wrong. He was ready. The fourth man died at 12 in the morning, just as the sun began to show through the cypress trees. His name was Thomas Whitmore, the colonel's eldest son, 23 years old, the heir to everything his father had built. He died trying to prove himself, trying to spot the enemy that had killed his friends, trying to be the hero his father had always wanted. Jabari shot him from 40 yards, a clean shot through the heart. Thomas fell into the water and did not rise. The colonel screamed. It was a sound that Jabari would remember for the rest of his life. A sound of pure anguish, of a father watching his son die. For a moment, just a moment, Jabari felt something that might have been pity. Whitmore was a monster, but monsters could love their children, could feel pain when those children were taken from them. Then Jabari remembered Amara, his own sister, threatened with a knife because of men like Whitmore, men who saw other human beings as animals to be used and discarded. He remembered the ship, the darkness, the sound of people dying in chains. He remembered every humiliation he had endured at Belmont, every cruelty inflicted on the workers he had come to know. The pity died. Colonel Jabari's voice echoed through the swamp, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Your son is dead. Your home is burning. Your slaves are free. He paused, letting each word strike like a blow. Come and face me man to man, hunter to hunter, or run home and find ashes. Whitmore's response was incoherent, a stream of curses and threats that meant nothing, but Jabari could see him moving, could see him pushing through the water toward the source of the voice, rifle raised, eyes wild with grief and rage. The other hunters tried to follow, but Jabari had planned for this. The obstacles he had created, fallen trees and hidden channels, separated Whitmore from his men, channeled him toward a specific location, a clearing on a small island where Jabari waited. They faced each other across 20 feet of muddy ground. Whitmore looked like a man who had lost everything. His clothes were torn and filthy. His face was scratched from branches he had pushed through blindly. His eyes red from grief and sleeplessness fixed on Jabari with a hatred so intense it seemed to distort the air between them. Jabari looked like what he was, a hunter, a warrior, a man who had come through fire and emerged stronger. You think you've won, Whitmore said. His voice was steady now, cold, the voice of a man who had accepted death and no longer feared it. You've killed my son. You've burned my home. You think that makes you the victor? No, Jabari said. I think it makes us even. Whitmore laughed, a sound without humor. You think the life of my son equals the lives of animals. You think your pathetic revenge balances any scale. I think, Jabari said slowly, that you are going to die in this swamp. And I think that when you die, you will know that everything you believed was a lie. You are not superior. You are not civilized. You are a small man with a loud voice, and the world will forget you existed within a generation. Whitmore raised his rifle. Jabari was faster. He had dropped his own rifle minutes ago, knowing that this confrontation would come, knowing that he wanted to end it differently. He crossed the 20 feet between them before Whitmore could aim, slammed into the colonel with his full weight, drove him to the ground. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air. They fought. Whitmore was not a weak man, not old, not inexperienced in violence. He had killed men before in war and in peace. And he fought now with a desperate strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. But Jabari was stronger, faster, better trained. He had fought leopards and lions, creatures that could kill a man in seconds, and he had won. Whitmore, for all his cruelty, was just a man. The fight lasted less than a minute. When it was over, Whitmore lay on his back in the mud, Jabari's knee on his chest, Jabari's hands around his throat. The Colonel's face was turning purple. His eyes bulged. His hands clawed uselessly at Jabari's arms. Jabari leaned close. "I could kill you now," he said. "I should kill you for your son's death, for the people you enslaved, for everything you have done." He squeezed tighter, watching Whitmore's eyes begin to glaze. "But death is too easy for you. Death is escape. I want you to live." He released his grip. Whitmore gasped, coughed, sucked air into his lungs. He tried to speak, but his throat was too damaged. "I want you to live," Jabari repeated, "so that you can see what comes next. Your slaves are gone. Your home is ashes. Your son is dead. Your wealth, your power, your precious white superiority, all of it is gone. And you will spend the rest of your miserable life knowing that it was taken from you by the people you called animals." He stood up, looking down at the broken man in the mud. "That is my revenge." He left Whitmore there and walked away. The remaining hunters found their leader an hour later, alive but destroyed. His second son had survived the night, as had 4 of the other men. They carried Whitmore out of the swamp on a makeshift stretcher, a journey that took most of the day. When they reached Belmont, they found exactly what Jabari had promised: ashes. The main house was gone. Nothing but a blackened shell. The outbuildings were gone, the stables, the gin, the presses, all gone. The cabins where the workers had lived still stood, empty now, monuments to the system that had died along with everything else. There were no workers. There were no horses. There were no supplies. There was nothing but destruction and absence. A void where Whitmore's empire had been. The Colonel was taken to a hospital in New Orleans, where doctors treated his injuries and tried to understand the babbling story. He told about an African giant who commanded wolves and spirits and had destroyed everything with supernatural power. They assumed he had gone mad with grief. Perhaps he had. Meanwhile, Jabari had already rejoined the Exodus. He caught up with Solomon and the others on the second day of their journey, appearing suddenly from the forest like a ghost. The children screamed when they saw him. The adults reached for weapons before they recognized him. Solomon embraced him like a son. "It's done," Jabari said. "Whitmore lives, but he is broken. He will not follow." And the others? 4 dead. The rest fled. Jabari paused, remembering his son died, the older one. "I killed him." Solomon nodded slowly. He did not offer sympathy or condemnation. He understood that war was war, that the death of an enemy's child was tragedy, but not crime, that Jabari had done what was necessary to ensure that everyone else could be free. "Then we move," Solomon said. "We have a long way to go." They moved. The journey to Kansas took 43 days. It was the hardest thing any of them had ever done. Harder than the backbreaking labor of the fields. Harder than the beatings and the deprivations. Harder than anything they had experienced in lives filled with hardship. They walked through forests and swamps, across rivers and prairies, through territory that was sometimes friendly and often hostile. They moved mostly at night, hiding during the day, avoiding roads and towns where white faces might mean capture or death. They lost people along the way. An old woman named Martha died on the 12th day, her heart giving out during a difficult river crossing. A young man named Peter was shot by a farmer who caught him stealing corn from a field. A child, a little girl no more than 3 years old, developed a fever that no medicine could cure. Each death was a wound, each loss was a reminder of what the journey cost, but they kept moving. Jabari became their protector, their scout, their hunter. He ranged ahead of the group, identifying dangers, finding safe paths, killing game to supplement their dwindling supplies. He taught the younger men what he knew about tracking and stalking and survival. Knowledge that had been passed down through his family for generations, and that would now take root in American soil. He also learned English properly beyond the functional pidgin he had developed at Belmont. He learned about America, its history and geography, and the impossible contradictions that defined it. A nation built on freedom that had enslaved millions, a democracy that had denied humanity to people based on the color of their skin. He learned about the war that had supposedly ended slavery, about the Reconstruction that was supposed to rebuild the South, about the 1,000 ways that white Americans had found to maintain their power, despite losing on the battlefield. And he learned about the people he traveled with. He learned their names and their stories, their hopes and their fears, their strengths and their weaknesses. He learned that Solomon had once been a preacher, had led secret worship services in the quarters, had kept faith alive among people who had every reason to despair. He learned that Ruth had been born free in Philadelphia, had been kidnapped and sold at the age of 16, had spent 20 years dreaming of escape. He learned that Isaiah's grandfather had been African, had told stories of the homeland that Isaiah had memorized and now told to others, a chain of memory that connected Louisiana to the Congo across 200 years of separation. They became his people, not by blood, but by something stronger, by shared struggle, by mutual sacrifice, by the simple fact that they had survived together what should have been unsurvivable. On the 4th day, they crossed into Kansas. The town was called Nicodemus, and it had been founded 2 years earlier by formerly enslaved people from Kentucky who had heard that Kansas was a place where black people could own land and govern themselves. By 1869, it had a population of about 300 spread across several hundred acres of prairie that they were slowly transforming into farms. The arrival of 217 refugees from Louisiana was overwhelming. The town did not have enough housing, enough food, enough anything to accommodate such a sudden influx. But the people of Nicodemus did what they could. They shared what they had. They built shelters. They found ways to feed everyone until the newcomers could establish themselves. Jabari was offered a place in the community, but he declined. "I cannot stay," he told Solomon on the night after their arrival. "This is your home now, but it is not mine. Where will you go?" Jabari looked west toward the setting sun, toward the vast expanse of America that he had only begun to understand. "I do not know, but I know that I am not finished. There are others like me, others who were taken from Africa, others who are still trapped in places like Belmont. If I can help them, I must." Solomon nodded. He had expected this. He had seen something in Jabari from the beginning, a restlessness that could not be contained by any single place, a purpose that extended beyond personal survival. "Then go," Solomon said. "Do what you must. But know that you will always have a home here whenever you want to return." Jabari left Nicodemus the next morning. He spent the next 23 years traveling across the American South and West, sometimes alone, sometimes with others who shared his purpose. He helped establish escape routes for people still trapped in conditions of slavery or near slavery. He fought against the forces of white supremacy wherever he found them in battles that were sometimes physical and sometimes political, and sometimes simply a matter of being present, of showing that black men could be strong and free and unbroken. He never returned to Africa. The journey was too long, the cost too high, and by the time it might have been possible, too many years had passed. His family, if any survived, would not know him. His village, if it still existed, would have changed beyond recognition. America became his home, not by choice, but by circumstance. He married in 1878 a woman named Clara, who had escaped slavery in Georgia and had been working as a teacher in a freedmen's school in Tennessee. They had 4 children together, 3 boys and a girl. He taught them everything he knew, the hunting skills of his ancestors, the survival techniques he had developed, the lessons of courage and perseverance that his life had taught him. He also told them stories. Stories of Africa, the land he remembered with increasing difficulty as the years passed, but refused to forget. Stories of the ship, the darkness, the journey that had brought him to this country. Stories of Belmont, of the hunt, of the night when everything changed. Stories of Solomon and Ruth and Isaiah, of the people who had trusted him with their lives and had not been disappointed. And stories of his sister Amara, whom he had saved through his own capture, and whom he would never see again. Jabari died in 1892 at the age of 40 from a fever that swept through the small town in Oklahoma where he had finally settled. His death was noted in the local newspaper with a brief paragraph that described him as a farmer and community leader, without mentioning anything of what he had done. But the people who knew him remembered. They remembered a man who had stood 7 feet tall and had moved through the world with a grace that seemed impossible for someone his size. They remembered a man who had faced impossible odds and had won, not through strength alone, but through intelligence and patience and the refusal to accept defeat. They remembered a man who had taught them that the color of your skin did not determine your worth, that the circumstances of your birth did not define your destiny, that every hay snorts. Human being had the capacity for courage if they chose to use it. Most of all, they remembered what he had taught them about revenge. True revenge, Jabari had said, was not about killing your enemies. It was about outliving them. It was about building something they said could not be built, becoming something they said you could not become, proving through your existence that everything they believed was wrong. Colonel Marcus Whitmore died in 1874, 5 years after the hunt. He had never recovered from that night in the swamp, never rebuilt his plantation, never regained his wealth or his standing. He spent his final years in a boarding house in New Orleans drinking himself to death, telling anyone who would listen about the African giant who had destroyed him. No one believed him. No one cared. He died alone, forgotten, a footnote in a history that was already moving past him. Jabari died surrounded by family and a community he had helped build, leaving behind children and grandchildren who would carry his legacy forward for generations. That was his revenge. In 1936, a researcher from the Federal Writers Project traveled to Oklahoma to interview elderly African Americans about their lives. Among the people she interviewed was a woman named Constance Walker, 91 years old, who had been born in Kansas in 1845 and had spent most of her life in the West. Constance had a story she wanted to tell. She had heard it from her husband, who had heard it from his father, who had been present at Nicodemus when the refugees from Louisiana arrived in 1869. The story was about a giant African man who had killed slave hunters in the swamps of Louisiana, who had led 200 people to freedom across 500 mebit of hostile territory, who had become a legend among black communities throughout the South and West. The researcher wrote down everything Constance told her. The transcript was filed with thousands of others stored in archives that would not be fully examined for decades. In 1976, a historian named Robert Williams discovered the transcript while researching post-Civil War African American communities. He was intrigued by the story of the African giant, which seemed too dramatic to be true, but too detailed to be entirely invented. Williams spent 3 years following the trail. He found records of illegal slave ships arriving in Cuba in 1868, including manifests that listed African captives by height and distinguishing features. He found newspaper accounts of a fire at a Louisiana plantation called Belmont in August of 1869, described as accidental but never fully explained. He found census records showing a sudden increase in the black population of Nicodemus, Kansas in late 1869. He found death records for a man named Jabari Walker in Oklahoma in 1892, noting that the deceased was of unusual height and African birth. Piece by piece, he assembled the story. Williams published his findings in 1982 in a book called The Giant of Louisiana that became a minor classic of American history. The book brought Jabari's story to a wider audience, inspiring documentaries, novels, and eventually a movement to establish a memorial at the site of the former Belmont plantation. The memorial was dedicated in 2012 on land that had been purchased by a coalition of civil rights organizations and American historical societies. It stands today, a bronze statue of a man nearly 7 feet tall, his face turned toward the north, his arms outstretched as if welcoming everyone who approaches. At the base of the statue is a plaque with words that Jabari reportedly spoke to his children, passed down through 4 generations of oral tradition. They called me an animal. They said I had no soul, no mind, no right to live as a man. They put me in chains and told me I was property. But chains cannot hold a spirit. Cages cannot contain a will. I am not what they called me. I am what I have always been, a hunter, a warrior, a free man. Beneath those words is a single line added by the Memorial Committee. The love of freedom lives in every human heart. Every year on August 14th, the anniversary of the hunt, people gather at the memorial to remember what happened there. They come from across the country, descendants of the people Jabari saved, descendants of slaves from other plantations, descendants of free black people who never experienced bondage but understand its legacy. They come to honor a man who refused to be what the world told him he was, who fought back against impossible odds, who proved that resistance was possible. They come to remember. And somewhere in the swamp, in the channels and islands, where the hunt took place over a century and a half ago, the cypress trees still stand. The water still flows. The birds still call. If you go there on a quiet night, when the moon is full and the air is still, locals say you can sometimes hear something that sounds like footsteps in the water. Something that sounds like a man moving through the swamp, silent and swift, hunting or being hunted. It is impossible to tell. They say it is Jabari still watching, still protecting, still free. The story of Jabari teaches us something that every generation needs to learn again. It teaches us that the people who oppress others always underestimate them. They see size or strength or the color of skin, and they think they know everything there is to know. They think they have measured the limits of what the oppressed can do, can become. They are always wrong. Inside every person who has been told they are worthless, there is a spark that refuses to die. Inside every person who has been chained, there is a will that cannot be contained. Inside every person who has been hunted, there is a hunter waiting to emerge. Jabari did not defeat Whitmore because he was bigger or stronger, though he was both. He defeated Whitmore because he was smarter, more patient, more determined. He defeated Whitmore because he understood something that Whitmore never could. The person being hunted knows the stakes better than the hunter ever will. For the hunter, failure means disappointment. For the hunted, failure means death. That difference changes everything. It sharpens the mind. It focuses the will. It turns ordinary people into heroes and victims into victors. Jabari knew this. He had learned it in the jungles of the Congo, hunting animals that could kill him with a single blow. He applied it in the swamps of Louisiana, hunted by men who thought he was an animal. He was not an animal. He was something much more dangerous. He was a man who had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. The people of Belmont understood this too. Solomon and Ruth and Isaiah, and all the others who risked their lives on a desperate plan. They were not warriors by training. They were not hunters by tradition. They were ordinary people who had been pushed beyond the limits of what anyone should have to endure. But when the moment came, they were ready. They rose up. They seized their freedom. They walked 500 miles through hostile territory to build new lives in a place where they could be truly free. That is the lesson Jabari left us. That is the truth his story tells. Freedom is not given, it is taken. Freedom is not safe, it is dangerous. Freedom is not easy, it is the hardest thing there is. But freedom is worth it, worth the risk, worth the struggle, worth everything you have to sacrifice to achieve it. Jabari knew this, he lived it, he died still believing it. And his descendants carry that belief forward generation after generation, keeping his memory alive, telling his story to anyone who will listen. Because stories are how we remember, stories are how we learn. Stories are how the courage of the past becomes the courage of the present and the future. This is Jabari's story. Remember it. And when you face your own impossible odds, when you find yourself hunted by forces that seem too powerful to resist, remember the giant African who walked into a Louisiana swamp and came out the other side a legend. Remember that he was underestimated. Remember that he refused to be what they told him he was. Remember that he won. You can win too. That is the truth of the story. That is the truth of every story like it. The love of freedom lives in torture.